The United States military has the biggest budget on planet Earth, almost $900 billion a year. And right now, this week, the Secretary of Defense is sitting in front of the Senate asking for money because they're running out. Not running out in some abstract 5 years from now way, running out in weeks. Training exercises cancelled, maintenance budgets raided. And the reason is simple. The US has been fighting an undeclared war with Iran since February, and wars are expensive, way more expensive than anyone in the White House wants to admit out loud. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how $1 trillion war machine ends up begging Congress for cash, why senators from both parties are furious about it, and why this fight in Washington might matter more than anything happening on the actual battlefield. Let's get into it. The hearing. So here's what actually happened this week. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Don Kane, walked into the Senate Appropriations Committee to make their case for a massive new funding package. We're talking about $87.6 billion total, with $67 billion of that going straight to the Pentagon for what they're calling military personnel readiness and rebuilding weapons stockpiles. The rest of that package, by the way, has nothing to do with Iran at all. There's over $11 billion for farm aid and money for an Ebola outbreak response tucked into the same bill. Classic Washington move. Bundle the unpopular thing with things nobody wants to vote against. This wasn't some quiet budget request buried in paperwork. This was the first public hearing specifically about this war funding package since a previous ceasefire fell apart. And it came right after a genuinely brutal weekend. 4 American service members were killed in intensified fighting after that ceasefire with Iran collapsed. So picture the scene. Hegseth and Kane side by side in front of a room full of senators who are increasingly done pretending this is all under control. And here's where it gets almost absurd, because you would think with a budget this size, money would be the last problem the Pentagon has. But it turns out it's the first. The math that doesn't add up. Let's walk through the numbers because this is where it gets interesting. The war started in late February 2026. Trump's budget director Russell Vought has said publicly that the war has cost around $30 billion so far. Okay, that's a lot, but it's a fraction of the total defense budget. So why the emergency? Here's why. That $30 billion figure almost certainly doesn't include the cost of rebuilding US bases in the Middle East that have been damaged in Iranian strikes. It doesn't fully account for the ammunition that's been burned through. And it definitely doesn't cover what happens if this war keeps escalating, which, spoiler, it is. Back in March, just a few weeks into the war, the Pentagon had already gone to Congress asking for $200 billion in extra funding. Hegseth's exact quote at that time was, "It takes money to kill bad guys." So we've gone from a $200 billion ask in March to now a $67 billion supplemental in July layered on top of an $891 billion base defense budget for the year. And even with all of that, the Pentagon is still short on cash right now, this month, because, get this, they've had to ask Congress for permission to move $4.3 billion out of training and weapons purchasing budgets just to plug immediate holes. Think about it for a second. The branch of government responsible for defending the country is robbing its own future readiness to pay for its current war. That's not a hypothetical. Navy and Air Force officials have reportedly told Congress that some of their fiscal year 2026 operational funding lines will be completely dry by the end of this month. So naturally, when Hexeth sat down in front of the Senate, a bunch of lawmakers had exactly one question for him. How does $1 trillion military run out of money? It's not a money problem, it's a planning problem. This is honestly the most quotable part of the whole story, because when senators pushed Hexet on this, his answer more or less was to blame the previous administration. Bad planning left over from Biden, according to him. And look, I get why that's a tempting answer. It's the easy one. But here's the problem with that explanation. Hexet has been running the Pentagon for over a year at this point. At some point, it was like this when I got here stops being a valid excuse, especially when you're the one who just testified that the Pentagon is also sitting on roughly $75 billion in unspent funds from last year's military budget. Money that was already approved, already available, and just hasn't been spent yet, though Hexet argues it's earmarked for other priorities like buying advanced weapons systems. So you've got a department that has almost $900 billion already, is asking for another $67 billion, while sitting on $75 billion it hasn't touched, while also saying training has to be cut because there's no money. That's the contradiction that had senators from both parties raising their eyebrows. One line from the hearing that stuck with a lot of people. Lawmakers basically told Hexeth point blank, this isn't a shortage of money, it's a shortage of a coherent plan. And when he was asked directly whether the Pentagon will even request money to rebuild the US bases damaged in Iranian strikes, he wouldn't answer, didn't confirm, didn't deny, just dodged it. But look, this isn't just an accounting story. There's a much bigger fight happening underneath all of this, and it's about who actually gets to decide when America goes to war. The constitutional fight. Here's the part that I think doesn't get enough attention. This war was never formally authorized by Congress. Trump launched the air campaign back in late February, and at that time he predicted repeatedly that it would be over within weeks. It's now been going on for months, with no formal end in sight, and it's actively escalating. And this is exactly the scenario the War Powers Resolution was written to prevent. That law came out of Vietnam specifically to stop a president from unilaterally sending troops into open ended conflicts while Congress just sits there and rubber stamps the bills afterward. Which is why, and this is the part people miss, the pushback in Congress isn't purely a Democrat versus Republican thing. Plenty of Republicans have voted at various points to try to force an end to US involvement in this war, not because they suddenly love the other side of the aisle, but because a lot of them genuinely believe this sets a dangerous precedent. If a president can just wage war and then ask Congress to foot the bill afterward, that fundamentally breaks the separation of powers. And next time it might be a president they don't like doing exactly the same thing. On top of that, recent polling shows only around 28% of Americans think this war was worth starting in the first place. That's a strikingly low number, comparable to some of the worst approval ratings the US saw during the war in Afghanistan. So you've got an expensive war, a funding crisis, a president escalating anyway, and a public that largely doesn't support it. That's not a great combination for anyone involved. So where does this actually go from here? What happens next? A few things to keep an eye on. 1. Congress just went into a month-long recess, which means any real action on this funding package is probably delayed for weeks, even while the Pentagon says money is running out now. That gap is going to be uncomfortable. 2. Watch whether Congress approves that $4.3 billion reallocation request. If they don't, the painful trade offs officials have warned about get a lot more real a lot faster. 3. Keep an eye on whether the Pentagon ever gives a straight answer on base reconstruction costs. That number, whatever it ends up being, is going to make the current request look small. And honestly, the biggest thing to watch is just, does the ceasefire hold this time, or does the war keep grinding on? Because every week this continues, the price tag goes up, and the political pressure on both sides of the aisle keeps building. So here's the honest takeaway. The Pentagon isn't broke because America doesn't spend enough on its military. It's the opposite problem. A war that was never voted on, that keeps escalating past every prediction, running headfirst into a budget that simply wasn't built for it. And now Congress has to decide whether to keep paying the bill for a war most Americans never actually wanted. Now, a question to you. Do you think Congress should be forcing an end to this war or letting it play out?